Hey, it's Solei, and this is episode 3 of the True North Now. I am ecstatic to be with Mechanic to go over all things OpReturn and filters and Bitcoin knots, and been just really anxious to get him on. And you were super busy in Prague, so thank you for making the time. Do you want to go ahead and just give people a little bit of your background before you get started?
Yeah, sure. I'm a not techie guy. I'm an old musician that got interested in Bitcoin long time ago, and Bitcoin was more interested in the music, so it became my passion. And been here now for 14 years, and never a dull day.
Heck yeah. What kind of music?
All sorts, what I was a jack of all trades, so I played
Yeah,
different instruments, and played for different artists and stuff, but you know,
cool. My
nothing
son's
really worth mentioning.
Yeah, my son's a musician too,
Oh, sweet.
and we offer to give him lessons for guitar, and he's like, "I'll just teach myself." So he just goes online and teaches himself how to do stuff. So
Oh yeah, man. YouTube changed the game. If you want to learn a skill,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, for sure. And I pretty much told him like, don't just make whatever kind of music you want, stack sats, and everything else will work itself out. It'll be fine.
yeah.
All right, so the real reason we're here is all of the excitement around Bitcoin knots, filters, op return. You want to just lay it out as you see it, however you like to get it started?
Oh man, it's such a big topic, but really, I just see it as a case of there being no reason for us to be relaying trash around the network. There are some justifications for it, but they're pretty weak, and they also violate historical precedent. We've, as a network, we've always tried to limit, you know, the relaying of non-monetary activity in Bitcoin. That's never been a controversial thing. We've always done it. It started way back with Satoshi. There's a bunch of people that there was a conversation between Satoshi and Gavin and a few others where people are realizing, wait a minute, the blockchain stores data, right? So what's to stop me uploading Lady Gaga videos? That was sort of the conversation. And, Satoshi was like, oh my, well, the less that happens, the better. And there are things we can do to prevent it. And it was always the understanding that let's try and keep that to a minimum, right? Because no one that's
Right,
running a Bitcoin node is interested in becoming cloud storage. Like, that's just not
yeah,
why I run a node. Fundamentally, I run a node because Bitcoin is money and I want to use that money permissionlessly. So I need to have a copy of the UTXO set, and I need to, for most of the reasons people would run a Bitcoin node today, I need all the archival data as well. So I need a redundant copy of 800 gigabytes of stuff that's all related to this perfect monetary network. And if people can hijack that and make it so that by virtue of wanting to be a participant in Bitcoin as a Bitcoiner, I now have to store a bunch of trash too. And I have to help in the relaying of that trash around from the people that create it to the miners that put it in the chain. This is completely backward. And I can't believe how far we've strayed from what we were initially, working on. Everyone back in the day saw non-monetary uses of Bitcoin as perhaps inevitable, but always undesirable and very much something you can keep to a minimum if you want. And that's where you get into the discussion around spam filters, because to this day, and I'll give more context on that in a minute, you have a limit of the olive branch approach of storing data, i.e., OpReturn, and you have a standard filter set to 80 bytes that prevents, effectively keeps to a very, very small amount any op returns bigger than 80 bytes. So to this day, if spammers want to use op return, then 99 point something percent of the time, the op returns they generate are smaller than 80 bytes because they have to fit within the standard spam filters that prevent them from being larger than that. And Core came along recently and said, well, they could always get around that if they want, because bigger than 80 byte op returns are consensus valid. So this filter isn't really doing anything. So we're just going to get rid of it. And this is insane because, as I said, 99% plus OpReturns respect the filter. So the filter very much does something. And there's it's a very disappointingly, it's been a very slippery debate because whenever I try and nail them down on a position, they go, well, we didn't say it doesn't do anything. We said it creates bad second order effects. And they keep slipping from one position to the other. But very simply put, spam filters are a thing that keeps Bitcoin the money, as much the money as it can be, and and it minimizes how much it might be things that aren't money. So just like Knut van Holm likes to point out, houses are somewhere you live, and the extent to which they can be used as a surrogate store of value because money is broken otherwise is the extent to which houses suck as a place to live because they get overpriced and because they're doing something that isn't a family buying a house to live. They're doing something else they shouldn't be doing, and it breaks them. It makes them less useful for the thing they're designed for. So really, fundamentally, the extent to which Bitcoin can be used for stuff that isn't money is the extent to which it can be abused. And there is always going to be room for abuse of any protocol that fits within the crude, protocol rules, as spam does in any context. But saying that there is nothing you can do about it, or that there are some terrible things that happen if you try and counter it, is disingenuous, and it leads to a broken network. So I'll round off there for my intro.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's no historical precedent for it, and I guess I would consider myself a bit in the ossify camp. Like, if there are bugs, of course I want to fix bugs. Like, I don't want threats to the system. But would you say that the ability to even do this is a bug that was introduced with like SegWit, Taproot, and that in itself needs to be patched, not enabled?
Well, that's so you're starting to zoom out a bit there. I know I'm going
Okay.
in and out and in and out. So OpReturn has nothing to do with any of that stuff. As I
Okay.
said, OpReturn was the olive branch. It was supposed to be, because there are basically three ways now, and there were initially just no. There are a bunch of ways you can store spam in Bitcoin, and some of them are more harmful than others. Widely acknowledged to be the most harmful way to store spam in Bitcoin is fake public keys. Fundamentally, we're not analyzing whether or not outputs that are created in a transaction are actually spendable or not. So you can create something that looks like a public key, aka a Bitcoin address, that's part of the output of a transaction, that's really just some data that isn't actually a spendable Bitcoin address, or a spendable UTXO. And this is horrible because the UTXO set is it's a very cherished part of what a node allocates resource-wise, because that is how we verify blocks quickly. And it's essentially the main reason you run a node, is that when you receive Bitcoins sent to you, you need to know that the person who spent them consumed a genuine UTXO, i.e., did they really have a Bitcoin or not, to send me. So that's the UTXO set's a really important and expensive thing in the context of running a node. If you bloat that with creating fake outputs, it does the most amount of damage that spam can do. OpReturn was created as an olive branch because OpReturn outputs are provably unspendable. So you can send sats to an OpReturn output if you want, and then they're burned forever. They can never be spent. So anytime this has happened, anytime someone has sent some sats to an OpReturn output, that reduces the 21 million limit. So it was never quite 21 million anyway, but that's every time someone does that, those coins are just gone forever. They're just burnt.
Okay.
And but you also can create OpReturn outputs of 0 sats, which is what almost everyone does all the time, because why do you want to just burn sats for the rest of time? There is proof of burn is a thing, and that's sometimes interesting for people, but I digress. So OpReturn is, it doesn't bloat the UTXO set. So that was why it was given as an olive branch, saying, hey, if you guys are going to do this, if you're really going to annoy us with this stuff, we'll give you OpReturn. And I think it started at 80 bytes, then dropped to 40, then went back to 80. And in knots, it's been 40 forever. And that was enough to, even with 40 bytes, that's enough for a side chain plus an additional amount for whatever you want to use it for. And you can do an unbelievable amount with that. You can run, a side chain is potentially limitless, right? You can do so much with that. And there hasn't really been much call to bump it up. And suddenly what Core wanted to do was blow it up from 80 bytes. Bear in mind, we've fought wars about whether it's 80 bytes or 40 bytes. And they want to blow it up to 100,000 bytes. And that's by virtue of getting rid of the limit altogether, but there being another spam filter at 100,000. So OpReturns would only be limited at that point by the fact that that's the max size of any transaction is 100,000 bytes. And at that point, with an OpReturn that big, you're 10% of an entire block, because there's no witness stuff or anything, because it's just OpReturn. So coming back to the categories, you have another kind, which is what you're talking about with SegWit and Taproot. So SegWit was an upgrade that fixed transaction malleability and gave us the Lightning Network as a result, because we needed bi-directional payment channels and we had to fix transaction malleability for that to be a thing. But SegWit intelligently, and this is something I really want to stress in this conversation, a witness discount was the witness data would be moved into its own section, and that meant that you could no longer have that's how you fixed transaction malleability. But there was an interesting idea, which was, like I said, the UTXO set being huge is one of the worst things that can happen to Bitcoin. We want to shrink it, and that's, again, one of the motivations for OpReturn. But during SegWit, a nod was made to that as well by discounting witness data in a transaction. And what that means is, if you create a transaction, the inputs are cheaper than the outputs. So that's supposed to create an incentive for people to use more UTXOs than they create, which should shrink the UTXO set. So it's the equivalent of, turning 5 $20 bills into one $100 bill. It's literally going to physically take up less space, and there's the equivalent on your drive. And there was even a nod made that we don't want to make it any more than 4x cheaper, because people might start finding ways to store arbitrary data in the witness field, and that would go against what we're trying to do here. So someone did see that there might be a problem with it,
Right.
but this has been swept under the rug and memory hold, which is really disappointing to say.
Yeah, do you think that witness discount is a net benefit, or is that something that should be reduced? Because I had that listed as a question, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the net effect of it has been, and that's a good question. But I do know that it blew up in our face and did something we didn't expect, which we haven't had the collective humility to admit yet. And this isn't something I'm going to bash other people for and say I'm okay, because I made the same mistake everyone else did. There's plenty of discourse from back when the discussion was happening around SegWit, and I'll get into Taproot as well, that establishes the intention behind the witness discount being specifically to help shrink the UTXO set.
Yeah.
But the combination of SegWit and Taproot's not super relevant here because it just made something a little bit more cheaper still. But basically SegWit is the main culprit here for allowing the exploit known as inscriptions, which have massively bloated the UTXO set. And I mean, they've tripled it. We've gone from 4 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes, the UTXO set. And that from around the year 2023 to around a year after that, the UTXO set went from 80 million to 200 million. And there is, as Antoine pointed out, it's a little different because these UTXOs are spendable, technically, rather than the fake pub keys, which are unspendable. But the likelihood that they'll get spent is quite low. Some of them have been consumed, and we've dropped down to around 170 million from 200 million. But we still have a UTXO set that's 12 gigabytes instead of 4 gigabytes plus whatever natural growth would have given us without this massive spam attack, aka inscriptions. So inscriptions really are the problem, and this started a couple of years ago, and there were lots of advocates like me saying we need to filter this stuff out, because why on earth would nodes relay JPEGs and other horrible things around the network. They're an attack on fungibility with this whole concept of, rare sats. And, the last thing you want to do is introduce things like KYC and some sats being worth more than others and all that. That's just undermines everything a money can possibly be, because it is an attack on fungibility and it turns it back into barter. That's the last thing you want. But I mean, then suddenly all of these old things I spoke about in my opening ramble here was all of these assumptions that, people storing data in the blockchain's bad, and how do we minimize it, and how effective will our countermeasures be? Suddenly we were met with all this ideological opposition, people saying that's censorship and these are valid transactions. And this was new. No one had ever said anything about spam filtration being those things until 2023. And interestingly, most of the people saying it, if they ran nodes, had no clue what their nodes were doing, because you're filtering out valid transactions all the time.
Yeah.
Anything that works in a way, paying attention to what's consensus valid and ignoring all of the more subtle points around a type of activity is incredibly naive, right? I like to use the analogy, it's like someone came up and, insulted you gravely, called you an absolutely disgusting human being or something, and you went, well, it's valid English. It's just, that's not the point. The point, yes, they're speaking valid English, but they are being abusive to you. And you're going to want to defend yourself from people acting like that. And it's a distraction from what you might be pointing out or having an issue with, for someone to point out that it's valid English. That's not the concern here. So the spam attacks are always valid Bitcoin transactions. That's not the point. If they weren't, you wouldn't even know they existed. But again, spam email, everyone's sick of email analogies now, but spam email is valid email. But if you don't pay any attention to the fact that it exists and you treat it the same as everything else, then you don't have email anymore. It becomes unusable. And Bitcoin is no different. Bitcoin is unfortunately one of the most spam-prone systems in the world because it's so cheap. At the moment, if you want to store some crap in the chain, all you need to do is find something the nodes aren't filtering yet, which is most stuff, even though Core are aggressively getting rid of filters now. Find something that the nodes will accept, have it relayed around the network, a miner will put it in the chain, and then boom, 85,000 nodes are now storing your piece of data forever. That's forever. This is a seriously permanent database. And what, you paid maybe 80 cents in transaction fees? And there's no other spam like that. And people constantly tell me, well, the transaction fees will the fees from genuine transactions will outprice spam eventually. And I'm saying there's no evidence for that, because there's more and more spam every day. And the trend is quite clearly in the opposite direction. And as I said, spam on Bitcoin is unbelievably cheap relative to other systems. If you want to send 85,000 spam emails out and have them actually end up in people's inboxes or junk folder, let alone inbox, that's going to be unbelievably expensive for you to figure out. Just spinning up email servers and getting inside a Gmail, getting inside that walled garden requires serious dedication and resources. In Bitcoin, all it is make something that looks like a transaction that the nodes will relay and pay a miner a couple of bucks. And that's it. So it's a system where we have to be extremely vigilant against abuse. And if we're not, eventually that vigilance gets delegated to a trusted third party. And we all know what that means. That means protocol capture. It means no one runs nodes except centralized third parties. And that's every single cryptocurrency out there. Decentralized in name only, because no one actually runs nodes anymore, because it's a pain in the butt, because it isn't a focus of the community. And this is, I'm going way off here, but that's always been my main point here, is why do Bitcoin maxis get to say we're better than the rest of crypto? Why do we get to make that distinction? And it's only ever been one tangible thing you can point to for me. It's not the Immaculate Conception or Satoshi having the foresight to write himself out of the script. All these are great, but it's the fact that nodes remain the focus. The users remain the focus of all development decisions. They are the top of the pyramid, and all development decisions are downstream of that. And that was the block size war, and that was the impetus for keeping blocks small. And it was the incentive for the witness discount and all of these things. So to me, Bitcoin's losing its soul very rapidly if it fails to understand what's happening here. And we've seen 13% of the network migrate away from core to knots, which is unprecedented. And that's a massive immune response reaction against what Bitcoin Core have been doing here. And it's being ignored and dismissed. And that's the beginnings of another civil war that I've obviously been a really active part of, but that is only just getting started and needs to accelerate from this point, because we need to deal with this. And if we don't, I can tell you that in 4 or 5 years, there aren't going to be many nodes, and we'll just be another crypto.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the nodes being basically the soul of Bitcoin, because I was watching a video and this guy described it this way. It was the people who want to or send transactions, they want the lowest possible fees, and the miners want the highest possible fees. But it's the nodes that are in the center, and they're basically the volunteers of the system, and they get to, well, they should get to independently decide for themselves what kind of transactions they want to relay. That's kind of the way that I felt about it. Do you think I'm looking at it the right way, or is there another angle to that?
Well, there was, yeah, I mean, when the pull request to blow out the OpReturn limits first showed up, it did two things. It removed the user's ability to configure how large it wanted to tolerate an OpReturn, and it by default made it enormous. And so there were two gripes there. A lot of people were like, I don't care how big the limit is, but I do care that you're not allowing me to configure it anymore.
Right.
So that pull request ended up getting closed, and then another one opened that retained the limit, but labeled it as deprecated, which in software terms, basically, in core terms, historically, that means in some future release, it will just be unceremoniously removed. But worse than that, not only is it deprecated in Core 30, which is not yet released, but the second pull request was merged. So when Core 30 gets released, you're going to have this massive limit for OpReturn, or, well, no limit anymore. But then this configuration option that remains is marked deprecated, but is also now broken. It doesn't work the way it used to. So even if you don't like what Core did and you want to turn it back to 83 like you think it should be, in Core 30 it's not going to mean what Core 29 did when you set data carrier size to 83. So it's now broken and deprecated. And I mean, to me, there's the pragmatist position and there's the idealist position, and both of them are being, I'm rubbed up the wrong way in both cases, because the idealist position is, why can't I have control over my own mempool? I need to be able to configure this. I want to choose what I relay around the network. That's correct. That's the idealistic position, and obviously I agree with it. But more pragmatically, what Core set as defaults for people's mempool policies are in practice what 99% of people just use, which is what makes them so unbelievably effective. That's why, even though OpReturns bigger than 80 bytes are consensus valid, you barely ever see them. Is because by default in Bitcoin Core they're disabled. So you just never see them. The highway doesn't exist, so of course you don't see any traffic on it. That's the way I describe that. Over the last quarter you saw 13,000 OpReturns bigger than 80 bytes. And the amount of OpReturns you saw smaller than 80 bytes was in the millions. So it's not even 1%, right? So there's those two positions. One, do we want to allow users to configure stuff? In principle, yes, users should be allowed to configure stuff. But more importantly and more subtly, should Core have sane defaults? Because most people aren't going to touch this stuff anyway. Yeah, of course they should. And my bigger issue and my bigger concern with the whole thing is not them removing the configurable option, even though it's ideologically incorrect for them to do that. It's the fact that they're making the default be ridiculous, because that is in practice what's going to be, that will be reflected in what you see inside the blockchain. And I wrote the stupidest tweet ever, but it had to be said. Prediction: if we increase data carrier size above 80 bytes, you will see a lot more op returns bigger than 80 bytes in the blockchain. And the typical response was, you don't freaking say. And I'm like, I know, but this is apparently, we live in cloud cuckoo land and that needs to be said. So I think the current state of things right now is default policy needs to be sane. And the conversation around whose mempool is it anyway, core don't get to tell me what to put in it, that certainly has sparked some defiance and some people getting very angry with core. Like I say, it's ideologically indefensible to not allow people the choice over what they relay around the network. But at the same time, it's not the substance of the fight here. The substance of the fight for me is why are you forcing nodes, in essence, to be more or even lightly encouraging nodes to be more permissive of spam?
Yeah, it does seem like a good question because you mentioned some of the pull requests, but I think even previously there was a pull request similar to what Knots is implementing that was rejected, right? And basically like, oh, it's too controversial. But it does seem a little bit of an inconsistency that this most recent pull request is pretty controversial, but it was approved anyway.
Well, their argument against that is controversial amongst whom? that's their point there. So
people that matter.
Well, the controversy around, I mean, yeah, I find that hypocritical and it is frustrating. But again, it's not. I don't really want to get into those kinds of gotchas with them because I understand if you try and follow any sort of process, it's going to annoy people. And if you have too regimented a process, it becomes an attack vector as well. But all that's kind of gone out of that's all kind of gone out the window now that you have, in my mind, core just actively merging malicious changes. So once that happens, I don't really care about process or anything anymore, and I don't really care about how inflammatory the things I say are. I'm just trying to be as accurate as I can be. So I forgave core when they didn't merge the anti-inscriptions filter that you correctly mentioned is in Knots already. So you can filter out inscriptions easily. Yes, they can modify the way they do things, but it's a pain in the butt for them to do so, and it's worth making life a little bit more difficult for them, and it costs node users nothing. And I'll put an asterisk after that nothing, because there are some edge cases, of course, but I find them grossly over-exaggerated, and I've argued with Greg back and forth over and over about this, but I digress again. The controversy around merging the anti-inscriptions filter into core was annoying, and it felt manufactured, and obviously there is significant financial incentive for people who want to use 85,000 nodes as free cloud storage. They're going to come in and create controversy and say, hey, isn't that censorship? I thought this was a permissionless network, yada, yada, yada. Bitcoin is not permissionless in that capacity, and it's a false argument to make. You need to work within the incentives of others within it, and those don't always magically line up. And nodes have certainly no interest in making their own lives more difficult and more expensive by relaying junk. So a denial of that fact is not in service of this laissez-faire. How would you characterize it? There's definitely like a strong contingent of laissez-faire capitalists that I like and I'm sympathetic to, but they're selective, because what do you do about tragedy of the commons type scenarios if that is your ideology? I don't know, and I don't know that anyone really has a good solution to it. But I do know that as a node runner, I'm definitely not incentivized to relay this stuff. And I think the controversy against the PR helping with that effort was manufactured by people that stand to benefit financially from having 85,000 people blindly relay their garbage around the network without doing any sort of analysis around what it was, when it was trivially easy to separate these two things. A Bitcoin transaction from someone storing JPEGs. It's very easy to separate those two things, even though they are both valid Bitcoin transactions, right? And I felt, like I say, I found the controversy to be manufactured, and obviously the people creating it were financially motivated to do so, and their motivations did not align with the rest of the network who was using Bitcoin as money. But the miners perhaps were interested in it. But unfortunately, miners have no direct incentive to be interested in spam, which is really quite a curious thing to realize. Because when it comes to spam that is being relayed around the network willy-nilly, it doesn't make any difference to miners, except in a very short-term sense. Because if you find other use cases for Bitcoin that result in more transaction fees because more data is getting stored in the chain, all that happens is the price goes up effectively for block space, which motivates more miners joining, and then you have the anvil above every miner's head, which is the difficulty adjustment. So that just goes up in proportion. And once that's the case, then everyone is making exactly as much as they were before. It's just like if you were to say, all right, halvings are cancelled. We're not going to go from 3.125 Bitcoin down to half of that, in the year 2028. We're going to keep it the same, and then miners will get paid more. Of course they won't. It doesn't work like that, because there's just going to be twice as many miners if you don't do another halving, and then everyone gets paid the same. So you can't do this economic central planning kind of crap. So it's no surprise that the first PR for blowing out the OpReturn limits was from Peter Todd, who is also someone that thinks we have a security budget problem, and we must fix this by adding inflation into Bitcoin by either going above the 21 million limit with a hard fork, or adding in demurrage, I should probably learn how to pronounce that word, or via some sort of UTXO tax or OpExpire or something like that. And all of this is straight back into fiat land, where you have central planning, you have economists that want to redistribute wealth from one area to another, i.e. from hodlers to miners, thinking it somehow fixes things, and it just doesn't. So I don't know why I went off on that point exactly, but I mean, we're coming down to incentives is the point. Yeah. So as a node runner, I had no incentive to do this stuff. Your Bitcoin core, you make the default node software that everyone uses. So please make it have sensible defaults that reflect my incentives, not the imaginary incentives of miners or the obvious incentive of spammers, which is to fill the chain up with crap so they can run some Ponzi scheme. Like, I get that people are incentivized to store junk in Bitcoin's blockchain. I don't contest that. I just know that it doesn't align with my incentive to compete for already limited amounts of block space. I'll end the point there.
Yeah, sure. So I was arguing with a couple of my Bitcoin friends by the pool for like an hour around this particular topic, by the pool in Vegas, as one does. And they were both node runners, and one of them said that he didn't particularly, like, his server wasn't warning him, hey, you're running out of space. And he was like, hey, transaction fees, I don't think they're that bad. So what are the kind of the red flags that we should be looking for to make sure that we don't end up being the frogs that are getting boiled slowly and it becomes a problem before we realize what's going on?
Yeah, good question. It's not going to be crude stuff like that. That's the good, and that's the good and the bad element of all this. So a lot of people that are like naively coming into this and hearing what I'm saying, but they're getting confused in the technical stuff. The block size limit still exists. So the blockchain is not going to suddenly start getting larger than it otherwise would, assuming we'd have had generally full blocks. There's a lot of caveats there, because like in some cases, the OpReturn maxis will even tell you that OpReturns, because they don't use any witness data really, they shrink the size of the average block, because that's a valid point, but it's also kind of it's irrelevant, but it's true. So you're not going to see the blockchain suddenly grow by like a terabyte because we're doing this, because consensus still limits the size a block can be. And you're also not going to suddenly see masses of OpReturn larger than 80 bytes once Core 30 is released. It's not about that. It's the fact that you now have, in services of Ethereum migrants, people that want to do the kinds of thing Ethereum does, that want to come into Bitcoin to start doing those kinds of interesting things. Chris Guida calls them platform maxis, as opposed to, as juxtaposed with us, the monetary maxis. people that want Bitcoin to be a Swiss Army knife thing, a blockchain that's capable of a hundred different uses, that's super interesting and all that. The problem with that is it fails, like every other crypto fails, because you always have that tragedy of the commons. Who's going to run the nodes here? Why is anyone motivated to do all this stuff? And you have to get back to, why is anyone running a node in the first place? They're running a node because they want to participate in Bitcoin, the monetary network, permissionlessly. And that's what the people you're speaking to want to do. That's why they're running a node, and that's why they want to do that. And they're not running it as a free service to store other people's JPEGs on. That's
Right.
not why they're doing it. And if development decisions lose sight of what the actual focus is here, because you're looking at developers that are looking at things technically, and everything they say is true, but they're missing the point. Bitcoin is not a spreadsheet. It's not a database. It's money, which is, and what is money? Money is a human thing. It's a thing we understand from one. It's a protocol that we adopt voluntarily, and we assess how adopted it is when judging its utility as a store of value and medium of exchange. And these are subtle things that can't be transposed easily from one thing to another. So again, when Peter Todd said Bitcoin is just a chain of blocks like any other crypto, it's nothing special, please pay attention to the fact that that is how these people think. They don't understand that Bitcoin is unique, and its uniqueness comes from things that can't be easily quantified or written down. You can try and establish some metrics, like we have more nodes than other networks, or we have a higher hash rate than other networks, or we haven't changed our inflation schedule, or we've been around for this many years. But all of that is just backwards rationalization. Bitcoin, what actually makes it unique is its culture and its focus on sovereignty, and that sovereignty always has to manifest as independent verification of everything and independent participation, which is only going to come through nodes being run by people that use Bitcoin. So it has to be the nodes, that has to be the focus. And all that, getting back to the main point you're making, of what my friends are saying, the blockchain isn't getting bigger any faster, what's the big deal? I'm saying because the focus now isn't them. The focus is use cases that exploit them. And if that continues, year after year after year, you're going to just turn around one day and say, where have all the nodes gone? Why isn't anyone running them anymore? Because the people that designed the node software didn't care about their needs or their interests or their incentives. They just made the same mistake everyone does in crypto land, which is someone will run the nodes. It's not my problem. I don't care how unwieldy it gets or impractical or how much junk and abuse they have to tolerate. It's not my problem. I want to come up with new features. I want to do exciting things. I'm a 22-year-old developer with a point to prove to the world. I've got some interesting ideas. And it comes down to intelligence versus wisdom. There are so many things you can do, and Bitcoin is mainly special because of what it doesn't do. It's very, very simple, and it keeps it minimal. And the minute we keep trying to do interesting, fun things, is like I say, it's a Swiss Army knife. It's the worst screwdriver in the world, the worst corkscrew in the world, the worst toothpick in the world, but it is all of them. So you don't want Bitcoin to be that. You just want it to be money. And if you can just keep it primitive enough, maybe you can limit it enough to the point where you have genuine redundancy, and that is decentralization. So it's going to manifest that way. It's not going to be like, oh, the blockchain broke. Suddenly it's 10 terabytes and all of the Raspberry Pi nodes on the network died, and we don't have 85,000 nodes anymore. We only have 200. And now we're just as centralized as Ethereum or Solana, right? It's not going to be a massive moment like that. Like you say, it is boiled frogs. It is, why did it get like this? Why isn't anyone running nodes anymore? And this is why it's so dangerous, because it takes so many years for that to come. And it's why these little signs and signals we get, like OpReturn being blown out, are things we have to go nuclear about, even though I understand why anyone might say, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I'm saying because you have to understand the implications of this. Why are they moving goalposts around to satisfy Ethereum users? Why are you adapting the ecosystem around them? You need to be hostile to them, and then Bitcoin will remain Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I just started running my first node, and I guess I'll declare my biases. I did install knots, and is there a way that new node runners should be looking at this? Is there a first principles way? Like when I talk to shitcoiners, I don't attack their coin directly. I basically just say all the red flags of a shitcoin to me are like pre-mine, centralized, proof of stake, no fixed supply, and then I just let them deal with that, in their head. So, is there a way that new node runners can look at which code to run from first principles? Like, what kind of code or what kind of things should the code do and not do that lets new node runners decide what to pick?
I don't think it's a thing you can discern from the code currently.
Okay.
You can look at what they just did to OpReturn and be like, why did they just merge something? Why did they break a filter intentionally and not bother to fix it and just mark it as deprecated? That does seem sloppy. And you can look at the discussion on GitHub and see that there's a lot of sophistry there, i.e. people making disingenuous arguments and whenever they're held to task over it, they just sort of pivot. Because this is what I mean with all the excuses, saying, oh, well, you better have the same mempool as everyone else, otherwise your fee estimation will be worse, or blocks will propagate more slowly, which will cause centralization in mining. And these are all technically correct arguments, but when put in any real context, become completely ridiculous. No one in core cares about centralization of mining, because if they did, their whole approach to everything they're doing would be extremely different. So it's being used in a convenient way, just like, I must steer clear of political analogies here, but it's just like when politicians stand up and say, oh, someone attacked women and children, how terrible, when you know they've been doing the exact same thing for decades, right? So, it just comes down to that. You're like, we know you don't actually care about that, and you're just making that point because it's convenient. So these are the kinds of heuristics I use, and I know it's not first principles, looking at the code, but I mean, we're advocating people run knots instead of core, and knots is 99% of what core is. So they're basically the same thing. It's just knots retains some configuration options that core doesn't. Knots is a superset of core. It takes all of core's stuff and adds extra stuff. That's all. So if you want to review it and look at it, we would welcome that. And there's certainly some of the concerns around knots have been that it's basically the releases are just handled by Luke. Most of the code in it is written by people that aren't Luke, but people will still say it has only one maintainer.
Yeah.
And I understand why that's scary if on its surface. As far as I know, there's never been some sort of issue with knots. In fact, I shouldn't caveat that. There has never been an issue that would cause a bunch of nodes to go down if they're all running knots. And you have a lot of pressure on it now that it's almost 14% of the network is running it now, as well as some of the big miners, which is quite a thing. So 1% of the network is now Ocean, and as far as I can tell, that's all using knots to construct templates, which is really where the rubber meets the road, because even if we're relaying spam all around the network, if a miner is running knots and they're filtering it out, it's not ending up in the blockchain, which is really that's really the most bang for your buck you could get out of a spam filter, is if you're finding blocks. So from first principles, my assertion is basically just this is a cultural phenomenon, and you have this split now between the Bitcoin liberals and the Bitcoin conservatives, essentially. And I mean that quite literally, because they are genuine people with genuine temperaments. That is a genuine phenomenon. You do have a liberal and you do have a conservative. That is a thing. And obviously there's culture wars where people like needlessly stoke up the flames and tension between them, and somewhat that can be quite artificial, but genuinely it does seem reminiscent of that. Like the people that want the monetary maxis genuinely just want to keep Bitcoin as money, and they essentially want to close borders. And then you have the opposite contingent, which is people that are like, look, we have some interesting use cases and there's nothing you can do about it anyway, and throw in a couple of ideological concerns like you're being narrow-minded or prejudice or something like that, or this is censorship to disallow it, anything like that. Then you have classic cultural divide between liberals and conservatives. And everything that happens development-wise in core and knots will reflect that over the coming years, and has already been reminiscent of that since they've been around in 2014. But there isn't really, all that is to say, there isn't much you can go for in the code right now and be like, oh, this is the software for me. That isn't, apart from the spam filters, which are becoming radically a lot more different from one another
Yeah.
since 2023.
Yeah, you mentioned some people's concern with knots just being run by Luke, and the first time I covered it, one of my friends mentioned something similar, like or asked me did I have any concerns about that. And when I thought about it, I was like, well, wait a minute. If 99% of knots is core, you're really getting all the core devs plus Luke. It's not just one guy. You know what I mean? So you're actually getting more eyeballs on knots than less.
Yeah, I struggle with how to frame this because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
We say look, it gets the benefit of everyone in core, just like you said, plus Luke. And people say that's, you know, it's still just Luke pushing the button on GitHub to say release it, whereas Bitcoin Core has 5 people that can do that. I mean, sure, but if we say it's just Luke, this is the problem. If we're like, all right, it's just Luke, then they're like, well, why are you ripping off the hard work of all the core developers?
Yeah.
I'm like, so you can't win with
Yeah.
it. Like, if you say, hey, it enjoys the benefit of all the core developers, they'll just say, no, it doesn't. You're lying because you want people to trust it. And so the people that really are on the other side of this aren't going to be generous and let us have an easy way to speak without playing these silly gotchas. But
Yeah.
you can't win with that. There's a reason I run knots and it's safe. There is a comparison. There are other Bitcoin implementations out there that aren't forks of core, that are completely ground up re-implementations in different programming languages. Now there you have some risk, and that's manifested before. The most obvious example is BTCD, which is Roast Beef's implementation. I guess it's written in Go because he likes Go.
Uh-huh.
And that crashed before because it's a re-implementation of all the consensus code. So stuff can happen, weird transactions can happen, edge cases like the one Brock created, which was a 998 of 999 multi-sig Taproot transaction. And it broke BTCD because that could only handle 500 or less. And yeah, half the Lightning Network went down because BTC died, but Bitcoin Core and importantly Bitcoin Knots carried on because they have the same consensus code. So there are risks that are kind of theoretical and there are risks that are much more serious. And Knots falls into the former category for me. I'm not worried about it breaking. And if something weird happens and it breaks Knots, 99% of the time that's going to break Core too, which is probably on balance a good thing because you want the whole, if Bitcoin breaks, you want the whole thing to kind of break in a clean way. You want a clean cut. You don't want 20% of the network broke, 30% of the network didn't. We had a bit of a blockchain and we had a race condition where there were 2 blockchains going on at once, accidental forks, things like that have happened before. That's horrible. You really want everyone to be like, there's a problem, we all agree on the fix, and then it's quick, right? That's why like soft forks are basically impossible in Bitcoin unless it's like, oh, there really is a quantum computer now, or, oh, we really do need to fix the Unix time thing. Everyone agrees those are problems and everyone will fix unanimously at the same time. So that's really clean. So Knots and Core being the same code base is really helpful in that way because it reduces a lot of inefficiency that might occur should there be an environment where some drastic action is needed.
Yeah. Without asking you to speak for Luke, if there's some motivated, idealistic developers out there, can they just step up and start helping them out?
I think so, but I haven't seen it yet. There's money there, but money isn't really the factor. I know OpenSats, Matt Odell has said OpenSats they don't discriminate. If they're giving you a grant and you're a developer and you want to work on Bitcoin, they don't care if you work on Knots or Core. The money's there the same either way. And that hasn't made any difference. So I don't think there's a lot of awareness around it is the main factor. But the point is, I don't think devs are particularly motivated by money. They want to do work they're interested in, first and foremost. But with Core, I mean, it starts to come down to a lot more like, this is, how do I put this in a way that isn't really bitchy and just like,
It's bring it back to the musician analogy again. Like I told my son, if he wants to make music that only he likes, he should only expect himself to listen to it. But if he wants other people to listen to it, then he should make music that's pleasing to their ears. And I think developers are kind of artistic people too. They want to do things they're interested in. But if they want the node runners to run their code, then they should develop the code that the node runners are interested in. And we've seen a surge in the interest in knots. So I think it's quite obvious what people want to hear.
I believe so. I mean, I'll admit it's not unanimous. There are plenty
Yeah.
of people that are paying no attention, and there are definitely some people who are wrong but are ideologically committed to treating all consensus valid activity as equal, which is just broken as an assumption for me, but they exist. But those people aren't running core either. They're running Libre Relay,
Mm.
which is because core is completely incoherent now. It's trying to reconcile its incoherence, but since the inscriptions bug and the refusal to fix it based on the controversy we already talked about that I found manufactured, that's I was saying for the last 2 years, Bitcoin is completely incoherent. Bitcoin Core is, because it has a bunch of spam filters. They just don't work. And you won't fix them because it's too controversial, but they're still there, just being routed around. And, I used this analogy before. It's like you have you guys say doggy door, right? We call them cat flaps in UK. You have a doggy door. You decided it needed to be a certain size so that your dog could get in and out, but a thief couldn't. And there was some debate around it, and it broke, and you fixed it, and it's there for a very good reason. But there's also an 8-foot hole in the side of your living room. So if you're not prepared to fix that, why are we still talking about the doggy door? Why is it there? It just makes this whole stupid building look like a joke. No one cares about this building, obviously. Because if they do, why do we still have this doggy door? And to be fair, Bitcoin Core just got rid of the doggy door. So they finally, they are getting more coherent. But at the same time, the doggy door worked. It did stop, yes, thieves could still get in my house if they kicked my door in. I know that. But they generally didn't. And now I don't have a front door at all. I just have a wide open wall, a gaping hole in the side of the street. I feel less secure. I know that technically I could always be burgled, even if I lived in Fort Knox. A motivated attacker can get inside and steal my stuff. That doesn't mean I don't get to have any of these countermeasures that actually are quite effective. I want to signal to the world that, hey, if you bust down this door, there might be a guy behind it with a shotgun. Are you sure you want to take that risk? These things work. Fences work. If you don't have a fence around your garden, it's more likely you're going to end up with someone having a picnic in it one day because they think it's just a random field, because you haven't indicated that this is a no-go area. So 85,000 nodes by default saying, hey, you've gone bigger than 80 bytes, or hey, you're trying to relay a JPEG. This completely affects the behavior of people trying to do that stuff. They have to find ways around it, and they know that what they're doing is untoward. They start to feel like hackers, which can be thrilling to some people, but also not thrilling in the slightest to the venture capitalists that invest in these protocols that want to build spam on top of Bitcoin. Those guys aren't stoked at all when the network starts saying, we don't like this stuff. They're not going to sit there and go, oh, well, we couldn't get it in the chain anyway because it's consensus valid. No, they're going to start asking questions like, why don't we use another network? Or why don't we use something the network isn't telling us it doesn't want? And these spam protocols are only a problem when they raise tens of millions of dollars and get enough funding to make it a perpetual attack. We don't care about people doing it if they don't reach that level. So that's the pragmatic argument for why all this is so effective, why spam filtration works. Because you only need to invoke it as a method at certain scales when the people you're defending against are huge and unwieldy and they can't just adapt around filters trivially like everyone pretends.
Yeah. So Bitcoin is peer-to-peer, and we've got some Bitcoin treasury companies that are peers as well, and they're stacking sats and becoming, very large economic pieces of the network. Are these things that Bitcoin treasury companies should be paying to as well as node runners?
I mean, of course they should, because they're participants in the ecosystem, and they are. I mean, Bitcoin's a medium of exchange. It's a store of value. They don't tend to particularly care about the former, which is sad. And I was really upset when Solei was saying, on Bitcoin Pizza Day, we paid for it all with dollars, not Bitcoins. Yeah. This is really a betrayal of what the entire concept of Pizza Day was, which is someone having the guts to go, all right, I'm going to trust a stranger on the internet to order me a couple of pizzas and I'll send them 10,000 bitcoins for it. It was a demonstration of it being used as money as we know it. And to literally say we would use dollars instead to celebrate Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, it doesn't make any sense, because Bitcoin not getting adopted as a medium of exchange is sad. But anyway, those two factors aside, it really does just seem like these treasury companies want to treat it as gold 2.0, but that doesn't lessen their motivation for protecting the system. Gold 2.0 is not maintained like gold 1.0. The scarcity of it is not a law of physics. The scarcity of it is a set of rules that need to be widely adopted and enforced to the point where they become reliable and dependable, I'll say. 21 million is not fixed in stone like the amount of gold there is in the universe, depending on like some supernova creating a bunch more of it, or us discovering alchemy. We basically can't make any more gold. You can easily make more of any crypto. If it's decentralized enough, it starts to become difficult. That's where Bitcoin gets its uniqueness again, right? You have enough nodes saying there are only 21 million Bitcoin for that to become meaningful. And you have enough nodes verifying and placing the restrictions on consensus validity on the miners that are mining blocks for miners to say, all right, I will roll double SHA-256 124 trillion times on average to guess a block, to jump through your hoop, because there are 85,000 of you. And so if I satisfy you, you'll give me 3.125 Bitcoins. And I know that once I get them, the requirement someone would have to place that you place on them, someone would have to meet that you place on them, is so utterly enormous that I bet I'm going to be able to keep that money. And all these guarantees that, tie in together, 21 million, if I mine a block, will it stay mined? All of these kinds of things, they all come back to the fact that you have all those nodes, and those nodes are not going anywhere. If, as a culture, we start to forget that, and that includes the treasury companies, because they're just one node at the end of the day, and they only validate once or twice. If you buy 100,000 Bitcoins and you sit on them for 10 years, you've used a node once. When you validated that, and you're not really using it like you might be if you were using, if you had a lightning node sitting on top of it and you were using it to verify everything going on, that's really using it. But at the end of the day, the fact that your coins are where they say they are is ultimately only as secure as the network is decentralized. And what we have is an attack on decentralization by saying, hey, we're just going to turn these nodes into spam storage. If you do that, then you're attacking 21 million. It's just a couple of orders of effect away. It does take a bit of experience to know how one leads to the other, but the funny thing is, it applies to gold too. Even though gold has its scarcity enshrined in the laws of physics, if people don't use gold right, if they all just start using paper gold because they can't be bothered to use it as a medium of exchange, then that becomes not really scarce either, and you just have fake gold everywhere, and it undermines the savings. So I guess that's the analogy for it. If everyone's using fake gold because it's not practical as a medium of exchange, which is what happens, that artificially inflates the value of it, and we know that happens. So the equivalent in Bitcoin is, if no one's running nodes or verifying anything, even though it's easy to use as a medium of exchange comparatively to gold, that undermines it in exactly the same way gold gets undermined. So if you want your Bitcoins to be worth something, they need to be part of a genuinely scarce set of UTXOs, and that has to be enforced properly. And if it's not, then you're going to have 100,000 Bitcoins of some massive amount of Bitcoins. It's not going to be 21 million. It'll be a lot more than that. So you need to make sure that doesn't happen. So that is why they should be paying attention.
Yeah, I'm a medium exchange kind of spend and replace circular economy kind of guy myself.
Me too.
I appreciate all your time. If you want, I'll give you the last word. If there's anything that I should have asked and didn't, anything that you think is super important, please just get it out there, or otherwise you can let people know how to find you and how they can support you and support knots.
Yeah, please run knots. And this is not my job or anything to say that. I work for Ocean. That's a mining pool. I want people mining and using datum, which means they create their own block templates, which decentralizes the second most important aspect of what Bitcoin mining is. Hard to quantify, actually, but running knots is the battle right now. If you want to create your own implementation too, I will work hard to support you. Obviously now, knots is the way to save Bitcoin and to prevent the rot that has set it into our institutions, and to defeat the complacency that just undermines everything and turns us into same old crypto. So yeah, you can find me a grass-fed Bitcoin, and I'm on Nostr as well. I don't know how to tell people how to find me there. And yeah. DMs are open, and you can run knots on anything. Start9s, Umbrels, Raspberry Blitzes, MyNodes, Debian, Ubuntu, Windows, anything. Run a node, use the node, and be a part of the conversation, because Bitcoin is not a foregone conclusion. It will survive, but it's not necessarily going to be all that great in the future unless people actually work to defend it and make sure it stays, good.
There you go. That's a great way to end it. I appreciate you very much, and you have an open invitation to come back anytime.
Thanks for having me, man.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Bye now.